Welcome back, everyone. UristMcSparks with you again, and it is time to finish up Roblox racing. We've been working at this for quite a while now. Started off very humble beginnings, making a car, making a racetrack, adding a couple scripts to make our game a little more interesting, stoplight, car respawning, and whatnot. Now it's time to put a bow on this, wrap it up, and make it a complete game. So let's dive in. Now, one of the elements of a game is that someone can win. In a racing game, it's really important who gets in first. And so we want our game to be able to recognize that. Otherwise, it's still not really much of a game. So there's a couple ways we can determine a winner. Well, actually, lots of ways for racing games. One way we're going to do it is with checkpoints. Basically, a player has to cross all the checkpoints to win. Sounds fairly straightforward. Let's go ahead and add that to our game. Again, I'm just adding this to my simple little circuit here. We'll probably want to add this to our bigger racetrack later. But for testing purposes, this makes it quick and easy. I'm going to start off with a part. And I've made my part nice yellow. I want to differentiate it from other things in my game. I'm going to drag it, my first checkpoint, to this start line. And I'm going to make it nice and wide, nice and tall, so the player just can't help but run into it. And I'm going to make sure can collide is off, or is anchored. And I'm going to make it slightly transparent. When we actually finish up the game, we'll probably make these invisible. Don't need the players to see them, but we want to know where they are while we're developing. And I'm going to go into the Explorer, right click on it, rename it, call it checkpoint 1. And we'll just copy and paste it. And we'll just move it over here. Doesn't matter exactly how big they are, as long as they cross the path of the track. And I'm going to have 3 checkpoints in my game. If you want, I want you over there. If you want, you can certainly use more, but you'll have to modify the script that we're going to write. You could do fewer, but you might see why this might be nice to have all 3. But there we go. I think 3 is a nice number to have. It should work with pretty much any kind of racetrack. Oh, and let's make sure that we name these properly. I will rename you to checkpoint 2. And you must be checkpoint 3. There we go. Terrific. Now I've got all the pieces in the map that we need for this. Let's go into our script. Same one we've always been working with. And we'll add some more variables. I'm just going to add some up to the top here. I'm going to say local checkpoint 1 is game.workspace.checkpoint1. Same old, same exact thing we've been doing. Just copying and pasting it a couple times, one for each checkpoint. So we've got variables, so we don't have to type out game.workspace.checkpoint, yada, yada, yada. One thing I'm noticing, my script is getting kind of long. I want to make sure that it's organized nicely. A trick I like to do is to put all my variables in one place. It just helps me, it makes me feel like my code is a little bit more organized. If I ever need to add a variable or remove one or change it, I know where to find all my variables. They're all going to be at the top for me. Okay, now that we've made our checkpoints, we're going to have to add some touch events to them. Just like the brick we added in our last lesson, which detected the player stepping on it so it could respawn the cars, we need the checkpoints to know that they've been touched by something, so it knows to record that the player drove over it. So let's go about implementing this. Just like we did for respawn cars, I'm going to make a function. Let's start with the first checkpoint. I'm going to say checkpoint 1 hit. And then again, just like the cars, I'm going to say checkpoint 1.touched :connect checkpoint 1 hit. Oh, don't need the double parentheses there. There we go, and we'll print out checkpoint 1 was hit. Again, just for our debugging purposes. So there's something we haven't been using with touch events, which is very important. And this is going to be using something of functions called a parameter. Now we've actually been using a couple parameters, possibly without knowing it earlier on. Notice in this wait function here that we called, we included this number 5 into it. Because when we said to wait, the computer wouldn't know how long to wait for. We just say, hey computer, wait. It would go, huh? I don't know. I guess you want me to wait. But if we give it a number, the wait function is expecting a number. It's going to say, oh, okay, the programmer gave me this number and I'm going to wait for that long in seconds. A function can do that. A function can say, hey, I'm expecting you to give me some variable, and that variable is going to tell me what I need to do. The function doesn't have to have that. For instance, our respawn cars, we didn't really need to know any other information. We could just leave it blank. But in this case, we're going to add a parameter called other part. Because what happens when a touched event happens is it calls the function that we connect to it, but along with calling the function, it also sends along a variable that has information about the other part that was hit. Because when two things collide, it involves two things. We already know the first thing because we know it was checkpoint 1, but we want to know what the other thing was. Because in this case, we want to know if that other thing was a player or not. If it was like some debris from a car or anything, let's say we added birds to our game, we don't care if those touch a checkpoint. But we do care if a player touches it, because in that case, we need to record that so that we can know if a player is getting closer to winning. So, to wrap this up, when you're defining a function for a touched event, you can add in this thing between parentheses, other part. And technically you can name it anything you want. I've seen it often described as hit, sometimes just other. I'm just naming it other part for now, just to be explicit. And this is still just a variable like all the other variables we've been using. It's going to have a name. I can print other part.name. And so if we went to our game, play solo, we ran over to our first checkpoint, boom, checkpoint 1 was hit, and this says the name of the part that hit it. Notice how it's head and left leg and handles, but those are part of my hats, maybe my business cat. Because you'll notice, we open up Workspace, and we look at the player model, it's got all these things in it. All these parts are the ones that hit the checkpoint. Cool. So let's go back to our script. Now we know what part hit our checkpoint. We need to check to see if that part was part of a player. If it was an arm or a leg or a head or something like that. Now before we did something similar, we said if object name is car, when we're looking for things to destroy in the workspace. Now we could use the name again, that would be fair. Not too many things in our game are probably going to have heads or arms or legs. But that's a lot of things to check for. Instead, one thing you'll notice about a player is that it has something called a humanoid in it. And that's the telltale sign for a player. So why don't we check to see if the model that this part is in, let's say the arm of, say the left arm of our player hit the checkpoint. We want to see if its parent, in this case the player, if it has a humanoid in it. So let's start this out with our if statement. And we're going to see if other part dot parent. Again, this is just to say the parent, whatever folder, so to speak, this part is in. That's all other.parent means. And we're going to use this special function called find first child. We're going to look for the child humanoid. Now remember when we did something similar to this before when we do get children. This gives all the parts that are inside a model or inside workspace. Find first child, on the other hand, just looks for one thing in particular and looks for something that's named specifically that. So in this case, we're looking to see if we can find a humanoid. If, say, our car, where's the car? I guess we didn't spawn a car, but let's say this model hit it. It's got a whole bunch of things in it, but it doesn't have a humanoid, so if that thing hit our checkpoint, this wouldn't be true. Say if other part.parent find first child humanoid, then let's go ahead and do something. First of all, I'm going to print a player hit me. Let's try that out just to make sure it's working as we expected. Okay, play solo. Wander over to checkpoint 1. Up. And look, the left arm hit it. Well, checkpoint 1 was hit. Knows it was the left arm. And it knows that it was the arm of a player. Cool. And hit reset. Now this didn't come up in this case, but there's a few things you want to add to checks like this in a touch event. This is just for your own sanity. Make sure your game is stable. First, we want to make sure that the other part exists. To do that, we're going to say this. And I just did two things here, and I'm going to explain them one at a time. The first thing was we're saying, is other part not equal to nil? Remember how earlier on we're checking if object.name equals car? This says, is the object name the exact same as this car? Are these two the same things? As if you look at this, is that the same as that? In this case, when you have this little tilde, the little squiggly guy, it's the one above your tab key. If you do tilde equals, that means not equals. And what nil means is nothing, void, empty. Because sometimes, let's say a part destroys itself when it hits something else, like a rocket. If other part was something that got destroyed, when we got to this line, we want to make sure that it's a real thing that we can do stuff to. If it does exist, then other part will exist, and it doesn't equal nil. But if it did destroy itself, it would be nil, and it wouldn't do the code that's in here. Don't worry too much about these particulars. Just know that this is good practice when you're doing an if statement, especially with a touched event like this. Sometimes the other part just won't exist. One other thing you may have noticed, I added this thing called and. An if statement doesn't have to check one thing at a time. I can actually check a whole bunch of things. In this case, we're saying if the other part exists, again, other part doesn't equal nil, and if the other part's parent has a humanoid, all of that is true. If both of these things are true, then we want to say that a player hit me, and then we can keep going. If neither of these are true, if for some reason the part didn't exist, or if the other part's parent didn't have a humanoid, if neither of those are true, then it just won't go into this code. I'm going to add one more thing. Again, this won't come up very often, but sometimes you want to check if its parent is also not nil. Again, the times when these happen, few and far between, but often enough that you'll just want to check them. Because occasionally, if you do try to check something that's nil, your game will break, and that's no good. We don't want that to happen. So, good rule of thumb, just do this. Okay, so now we're making sure that the other part exists, the other part has a parent, and the other part's parent has a humanoid. Ooh, we are certain that this player exists and it's got a humanoid. That's great. So what are we going to do with this information? Well, I would like the checkpoint to keep track of this. I'm going to let the checkpoint do this. And I'm going to use something called a string value to do this. So the string value is something you can add to any object in your game. Let's say I go to this checkpoint. I'm going to insert object, string value. This is pretty neat. We can rename this, like I could call this player 1. We can even store stuff in here, like Urist is super cool. This is just some text you can store inside of an object. And this is kind of a cheap way to store information. In this case, what I want to have happen is when a player touches a checkpoint, I want to make one of these string values and give it the name of the player. So later, if I want to, say, make sure all the checkpoints have been touched, just look inside each checkpoint. Does it have one of these things? Does it have this string value with the same name as a player? Now, I added this manually. I right-clicked, went to Insert Object, and went over to String Value. But we can't do that when we're actually in the game. I'm going to delete these, delete that. We can't just right-click on this and insert that. We don't have that in a game. But our script can do that for us. Now, before, we create a new object by copying an old one. But we don't have something to copy in this case. We're going to make something brand new. So I'm going to make a variable to store it in. I'm going to call this player tag. And to make something new, you use these special words. You say instance.new. And this is just a function. And we, inside these quotation marks, we say whatever kind of part we want. And these are any of the Roblox parts. So, for instance, if we wanted to insert a part, we just type part here. And player tag would be a part. It could be a cylinder. Just like when we made the wheels for our car. It could be anything, really, as long as you spell the name correctly. In this case, I'm going to have it be a string value. Pretty neat. And it's just going to create a new one. But we do need to tell it where to live. It doesn't come with a parent. It doesn't know who its parent is. So let's make sure that its parent is checkpoint 1. So when the game's running, and this happens, we'll create a string value, and we'll put it into checkpoint 1. And lastly, as I said, I want to make sure that its name was the same as the player. In this case, other part.parent.name is going to be the player's name. Because as you notice, you play solo, this will be the player's name. In play solo, it just defaults to player 1. When you're actually in Roblox, this will be your actual character's name. So in my case, when I publish it, my character's name will actually be UristMcSparks. It won't be player 1. And so, I'll just rename the tag. I'll make the tag's name the name of the character. Pretty simple. And since we have the game running, let's find that out, see if it works. So we have our checkpoint. It's got this thing called touch interest there because we bound a touch event to it. And oh, hey, look at all this. Whoa. Wow, cool. We've got player 1 tags all over the place. Oops, I didn't mean to rename you. Sorry about that. Yeah. Ooh, wow. So I'm noticing something here. Every time that I've touched this, I'm adding more because that's what the script says to do. It says, hey, every time when a checkpoint 1 is hit, if the other part exists, the other part has a parent, and the other part's parent has a humanoid, well, let's add it. Let's give one of these tags to it. Let's keep adding that. That's not super necessary. We don't really need a billion of these things. We only really need to have one. So one thing I'm going to do, inside this if statement, I want to see if we've already stored this. I'm going to check if checkpoint 1 find first child. Again, just like we use find first child here. In this case, instead of looking for humanoid, we're just going to look for other part.parent.name. And we're going to put all of this inside of that if. Because we all know if the other part, again, if this was indeed a player, we know that it was a player. And now in this if statement, we're checking, well, does the checkpoint already have something with that player's name? Basically, does it already have a string value in it? Well, actually, we want to say if not. And what the not does is it means kind of opposite. So, in plain English, what this says is if checkpoint 1 doesn't have a first child named other part.parent.name, so in this case, for me, it would be UristMcSparks, for you, it could be whatever. If it doesn't have that name in there, let's add it. So the next time we touch it, we'll have already added, well, let's try it out, and we'll explain as we go. So, we run up, we look at the workspace, we look at checkpoint 1, doesn't have anything in it yet. We touch it, has player 1. And if we touch it again, it doesn't add anything because when it gets to this line, it says, hey, checkpoint 1, do you have a child that's named player 1? And we're looking at it, it's like, oh yeah, we do. We do have something that's named player 1. Well, we don't need to do this in that case because we said not to do anything. Pretty neat. So I'm going to reset. Now we need to do the same thing for the other checkpoints. So a really quick way to do this, we can just do copy, paste, paste, checkpoint 2 hit. I'm just going to change all these things from 1 to 2. All these things from 1 to 3. Oh, and this is also something to change. It's kind of neat. Let's just try this out real fast. Make sure this is all working okay. Look at our checkpoints. Oh, I noticed one thing. I defined these functions, checkpoint 2 hit, checkpoint 3 hit. I did not make the touch events. So let's make sure we add those as well, because those are just as important as defining what's supposed to happen. Play solo again. The way I noticed that was in workspace. Remember how I said there was a touch interest? I noticed there wasn't one in checkpoints 2 or 3. So we touch that. Hey, player 1. We run over. Touch that. Oh, player 1's in there as well. And if we hit our last checkpoint, boom, player 1. Cool. Let's reset now. Now then, we've just been adding that player tag to our checkpoints, but I want to add a little bit of logic to this, because we want to make sure that the player is doing the course in the correct order. Because let's say I'm going to use this block to pretend this is a player. Player starts off, they drive and hit the first checkpoint. But let's say they somehow cheat. They jump over this rail, they drive over to here, and they just hit checkpoint 3 and go back to 1. We want to make sure the player is doing the course in order. So what do we want to do? So the player crosses the first checkpoint. That's fine. We don't need to worry about that. We'll just say, yes, the first checkpoint is hit. But when we get to the second checkpoint, we want to make sure the player has hit the first one. Because if they haven't, that means that the player somehow jumped over this fence, ran over here, and hit that checkpoint. In that case, we don't want to give them credit. You don't want cheaters to win. So we don't give them a tag in that case. They'd have to go all the way back to checkpoint 1 and then get to checkpoint 2 to get the tag. So how do we do that in code? Well, it's rather simple. Let's go to checkpoint 2 hit. So we've been checking if a player hit it. That's good. And we want to see if the player doesn't exist in there already yet. That's fine. But let's check something else. I'll use this same if statement. We're going to see and if we want to make sure that checkpoint 1 find first child other part dot parent dot name. We want to make sure that checkpoint 1 does have a child that has the name of the character, because that would mean that the player hit checkpoint 1 first before hitting checkpoint 2. Remember, this is the checkpoint 2 function. So let's test this out. We're looking at the workspace. We're going to open up our checkpoints. So this is 1, this is 2. And all we said is we want to make sure that we wouldn't get credit for touching checkpoint 2 first, if we skip checkpoint 1. I'm not getting a tag there, so that's looking pretty good. We'll go over to checkpoint 1. Okay, we got the tag for that. That's great. We'll go back over here to checkpoint 2. And now we get the tag, but only because in our script we said that checkpoint 1 has to have the player's name in it before we make a new tag for them in checkpoint 2. With that same thing in mind, I'm going to add that to checkpoint 3. In checkpoint 3, we want to check that checkpoint 2 has other part.parent.name. Whew, I'm realizing we've written a lot of code already. My gosh, look how long this is getting. It's amazing. But remember, we've just been taking it one step at a time. It can be very daunting to get into code and see all this stuff, but remember, we've just been taking this one step at a time. So now, checkpoint 3 shouldn't get a tag unless checkpoint 2 has been touched. Lastly, we want to use these checkpoints to see if the player actually won. So what condition would the player have won in? Well, they'd have to hit checkpoint 1, then hit checkpoint 2, then hit 3, and then hit 1 again. That means they've done a whole circuit. So we already know to only give the player credit at 2 if they've hit 1. Only give them credit for 2. Only give them credit for 3 if they've hit 2. And now we'll say, if they hit 1 and they've gotten credit for 3, then that player wins. Well, we already have a touch event for 1, so let's add more to this function for the first checkpoint. So we want to make sure that's the character again, so that's fine. We don't really care at this point about adding the tag. That's its own thing. We're going to add another if statement afterwards, which will be just checked after this one is complete. We'll say if checkpoint point 3 find first child, and we're doing this again, other part.parent.name, then we'll say print player wins. Cool, let's try this out and see if we can get this player wins message. And so we hit checkpoint 1. Oh, I'll open up the workspace while we're running. Checkpoint 1 is hit. Got the player 1. Oh, checkpoint 2. That's great. I'm also going to have to scroll down to the bottom of this. It's been adding a lot of text. Checkpoint 3 got hit. Scroll down to the bottom again. And now let's hit checkpoint 1 again and see what happens. Oh, there it is. Player wins. There we go. We know that this player has completed the course. So there's one more thing I'd like to do before we wrap up this particular lesson. It's all well and good that our print statement said that the player won, but I want everyone in the game to know that the player has won. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a message to the game. I'm going to do that in a function. So above where we've defined the checkpoint functions, I'm going to add a new custom function called function show victory message. In this case, I want to know the player name. So remember how in our checkpoint functions we defined a parameter here, and the touched event sent that parameter to say the other part that was hit. In this case, we're defining our own parameter. We are allowed to do that because I want to say the player's name who won. Now, to display a message, there's a couple ways to do it. I recommend looking into how to work with GUIs because those can look a lot nicer than what we're about to do. But this is a quick and easy way to do it. I'm going to say local message. We're going to use the instance.new again because we're making something new. There's a special kind of object called message. It just displays text on the screen. There's not much to it. All I have to do is say message.text. This is what to display. We're going to say player name ... Remember how we did ... earlier to... Did we do ... earlier? Perhaps we didn't. 1 second. I'll explain that. So when you're dealing with text, and what in programming you'll call those strings, for some reason, don't ask me why, I did not come up with that name. But if you're dealing with a string, basically just text, you can combine bits of text together. So in this case, we have the player name, but I don't just want to say the player's name on the screen. I kind of want to say more than that. In this case, I'm going to say player name has one. And I can just smush those strings together by adding these ... in between. That just makes this all one long piece of text. And we're putting it into the message. Lastly, I'm going to put the message in the workspace. That way it will be displayed for all to see. Now, I don't want that to be shown forever, so I'm actually going to wait 2 seconds. And then I'm going to destroy the message. We don't need that to be displayed on the screen the whole time. So let's go ahead and test this out and one more time. Actually, I'm going to do it with the car this time because I realize that walking is really slow and we're also making a racing game. It should probably work with cars. Oh, there we go. Again, I'm not that great a driver, but I think I'm doing okay. Get to the third one. And lastly, gotta get through there. Oh, looks like that didn't work. So what happened? Oh, well, we went through all the trouble of writing this function, but we didn't say to do anything with it. So I'm going to copy this here. And right in this if statement, we determine that the player won here. So we're going to say show victory message. And in the parentheses, remember, this function is expecting the name of the player. Well, let's give it to them. The name of the player in this case is otherPart.parent.name. So when the player wins, if they hit checkpoint 1 and checkpoint 3 has their tag in it, it'll show a victory message. We'll hit play solo, spawn us up some fine automobiles. Oh, keep forgetting there's a barrier there. I should be watching the light to see when I can drive. Yeah, and we'll do some sweet drifting around these corners. Run into other cars. Player 1 has won. And remember that name will change when you're actually running it on Roblox, and it'll say your actual player's name. So in my case, it would be UristMcSparks wins. So that's looking great. I think we've been going on this lesson for quite some time though, but stay tuned, come right back because we are going to continue finishing up and polishing this game, making it something really cool and fun. So again, this has been UristMcSparks, and in Roblox, you make the game.